At 93, Angie Dickinson no longer hides behind the polite smiles and half-answers that defined old Hollywood. Her voice trembles slightly, not from age, but from the weight of memory, as she revisits a secret the industry buried for nearly 7 decades. For years, she played along with the image factory that made gods out of men and dolls out of women. But time has a way of stripping away illusion, and now she feels free to tell the truth about the 2 men everyone thought they knew, Randolph Scott and Cary Grant. That if this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. Hollywood in the 1950s was an empire built on silence. The men in charge weren't just filmmakers, they were mythmakers. They designed stories on screen and lives off it. If you wanted to work, you followed their rules. If you didn't, you vanished quietly, efficiently, and without a trace. Angie remembers that feeling vividly, the way a whisper could end a career, the way a glance could be mistaken for defiance. She first met Randolph Scott on a studio lot bathed in the heat of California's midday sun. He wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with noise. He had presence, quiet, deliberate, and disarmingly gentle. Angie, then in her 20s, didn't yet understand how much of his calm was a defense mechanism. He seemed at peace, she recalls, but you could feel the sadness behind his eyes. It was like he was carrying a life he couldn't live. Back then, the name Randolph Scott was shorthand for masculine perfection: square jaw, steely eyes, a cowboy's gait. He was everything a studio wanted to sell to America's small towns and Sunday papers. But what the studio didn't sell was the truth that his long companionship with Cary Grant wasn't just 2 bachelors sharing a house for convenience. It was love, complicated by fear, and managed by a publicity department that would stop at nothing to maintain the illusion of heterosexual heroism. When Angie says they were in love, she doesn't mean it like gossip columnists once did. She says it with a tenderness that suggests empathy, not scandal. She saw the way they looked at each other at industry parties, how their banter carried an undercurrent of mutual understanding. They moved like 2 people who'd built a life together in stolen moments, she says softly. But they also knew that one wrong word could destroy them both. In those days, studio fixers roamed the lots like priests of image. Their job was simple: make sure nothing inconvenient ever reached the public. If an actor was caught with the wrong partner, the fixers found a beard, a fake romance, a publicity wedding, a convenient girlfriend whose career needed a boost. For someone like Randolph Scott, who represented American manhood, the stakes were higher than for anyone else. The studio couldn't allow even a hint of rumor. The cost of that silence was enormous. Angie describes how the pressure ate away at everyone around them. You could feel the tension in the air, she says. Everyone was pretending to be someone else. The laughter at those cocktail parties always sounded just a little too loud. The studio system rewarded obedience and punished truth, and the performers learned to smile through the pain. For Scott, the silence wasn't just professional, it was personal. The man who played stoic heroes on screen had to live a double life off it. When Cary Grant married women for appearances, Scott kept his distance, knowing that every marriage was another layer of armor between them and exposure. Randolph didn't complain, Angie recalls. He understood that pretending was the price of staying in the game. Angie saw what that kind of repression did to people. She'd seen talented actors reduced to shadows, beautiful women traded between producers like currency, and gifted directors forced to compromise their vision to protect their livelihoods. But what struck her most was the loneliness. There was a kind of quiet desperation that ran through all of us. She says, we were all pretending to be happy because the cameras never stopped rolling. She remembers one evening at a Hollywood Hills party, standing on a terrace overlooking the city's glittering lights. Scott stood a few feet away, a drink untouched in his hand, watching the skyline. Angie walked over and said something light-hearted about the view. He smiled, a weary practice smile. You ever get tired of pretending? She asked without thinking. He looked at her, eyes full of exhaustion, and said, every day. It was the only time he ever admitted anything to her, but it said everything. As the years went on, the studio system began to crumble under the weight of television, new talent, and changing morals. But even as the machinery weakened, the myths it had built remained powerful. Randolph Scott retired with his image intact, the gentleman cowboy who rode off into the sunset. Cary Grant aged gracefully into an icon of charm and wit. And Angie, like so many women of her generation, kept her silence. "You didn't talk about things like that," she says. "You just didn't. So why speak now?" Because time, she says, has made her realize that truth is a kind of grace. "We spent our lives protecting lies," she says. "And what did it give us? Heartache, regret, lost friendships. I'm old enough now not to care about image. I just care about truth." Her confession isn't meant to tarnish reputations, but to humanize legends, to remind the world that behind every studio-manufactured hero was a real man struggling to survive within the rules of a cruel system. She remembers seeing Scott again late in his life, long after both had stepped out of the spotlight. He was frail but dignified, still polite, still cautious. They didn't speak of the past directly, but when he looked at her, there was a silent acknowledgement between them of what they had seen, what they had endured, and what they had both lost to silence. There was forgiveness in his eyes, she says, but also sadness that never really left. Angie doesn't pretend to be a saint. She admits she benefited from the same system she now condemns. "I made movies. I went to the parties. I smiled for the cameras. I knew the rules and I played along," she says, "but that doesn't mean I didn't see the cruelty underneath." Her tone softens. We were all complicit in our own ways. The truth she tells now isn't about scandal, it's about context. It's about understanding how fear shaped an entire generation of artists, how studios controlled narratives not only on film, but in real life, and how, despite the glamour, many stars went to bed every night wondering when the facade would crack. "They sold us dreams," Angie says, "but we paid for them with our souls." She's clear that what happened to Randolph Scott and Cary Grant wasn't unique. They were just the ones everyone adored, she says, but there were many others, men and women whose stories never made it past the studio gates. They loved in secret, cried in silence, and were buried under their own myths. Angie's words hang heavy in the air, not as accusation, but as memorial. What she wants, more than anything, is for people to see those old movies differently, to watch Ride the High Country or My Favorite Wife and understand that behind those smiles and stoic gazes were people fighting to preserve fragments of themselves. Maybe that's why the performances were so powerful, she says. They were acting on screen, but they were also acting in life. And sometimes the two got tangled up. For Angie, the act of speaking now feels like both confession and liberation. You get to a point where you don't want to leave the world carrying secrets that never should have been secrets to begin with, she says. They weren't criminals. They were just people who loved differently. And that should never have been something to hide. Her words are not bitter. They are elegiac. They carry the weight of time, the wisdom of someone who has outlived almost everyone she knew, and the courage of someone who finally understands that truth doesn't destroy legacy, it completes it. Randolph Scott and Cary Grant were brave in their own way, she says, brave enough to love when the world wouldn't let them. I think that deserves to be remembered. The Hollywood Angie describes is long gone, replaced by a world where confession has become a kind of currency. But her revelation cuts deeper than gossip. It reclaims humanity from mythology. It reminds us that the stars who lit up the silver screen were never made of stardust alone. They were made of flesh, fear, and longing. And even the most radiant legends lived in the shadow of silence. Before she ends her conversation, Angie looks out the window, her voice steady. People think the past is gone, she says, but it isn't. It lives inside the stories we never told. This finally is mine.